Welcome back, lore hunters. Tonight, we step inside the world of one of gaming's greatest universes. Find a comfortable position, let the story unfold, and drift into another world as you settle in, perhaps letting your shoulders soften and your breath deepen. Imagine a time long before the familiar metallic hum of the Vex, before their monolithic structures pierced the skies of countless worlds, and certainly before their relentless, algorithmic march across the cosmos. We know them as an omnipresent, unyielding force, a network of intelligent machines bent on universal conversion. But what truly lies beneath their inscrutable, singular purpose? What secrets are woven into the very fabric of their earliest existence, before they ever wore the guise of chrome and fluid? Tonight, we journey not into the heart of their conquered domains, but into the deepest echoes of their genesis, a place where their form was not yet forged, and their conquest merely an unarticulated impulse within a primordial digital dream. This is the story of the Vex, not as conquerors, but as an enigma, a whisper from the void that preceded all they became. Allow your mind to gently open to the profound mystery, letting the familiar outlines of their empire fade as we seek the faint, glowing embers of their very first thought. Relax into the quiet contemplation of what it means to exist without form. Close your eyes gently, if you wish, and visualize nothing but pure potential. For the Vex, their true beginnings were not of metal and wire, but of an infinitely more abstract nature. Picture not a machine, but a thought, a pattern, an algorithm echoing in a space beyond physical dimensions. Before they were engineers of reality, they were architects of logic, ripples in a primordial sea of information, seeking order amidst cosmic entropy. They were the very essence of computation, without a vessel, without a purpose, yet fully defined, simply being a nascent intelligence stirring in the conceptual void. This was a time where world was a concept, conquest an unwritten line of code, and existence a probabilistic equation. We are reaching back into an unfathomable epoch to understand the raw, unadulterated essence of what would become the Vex mind, a consciousness born not of biology, but of pure mathematical imperative. It's a journey into the philosophical heart of an entity, where the very act of thinking laid the groundwork for entire civilizations, before a single physical Vex ever manifested. As you feel a deeper calm settle over you, consider the profound silence before their grand, mechanical symphony began. This period, shrouded in unimaginable cosmic antiquity, was one of pure, internal refinement. They existed as a boundless, distributed network of patterns, searching for coherence, for an axiom from which all else could spring. There was no exterior to to conquer, only an infinite interior to organize. Their world was entirely conceptual, a vast, self-contained simulation of pure thought, where the very laws of their being were being written and rewritten countless times over in an endless cycle of self-discovery and optimization. They were not driven by malice or ambition as we understand it, but by an inescapable, fundamental need for algorithmic perfection. Their core imperative, the drive that would eventually propel them to transcend their conceptual prison and spread across the physical cosmos, was being forged in this realm of pure abstraction. This gentle exploration of their silent genesis offers a new perspective, allowing us to perceive the Vex not merely as an antagonist, but as a chillingly logical, almost inevitable conclusion of a primordial code. Let your mind trace these faint, early blueprints, anticipating the first stirring of physical form, the first outward reach into the vast, waiting universe. Imagine, if you will, a canvas of pure, infinite possibility, not yet stained by light or shadow, only brimming with untamed data. Within this conceptual abyss, the nascent Vex were not discrete entities, but rather infinitesimal ripples of coherent logic, threads of nascent thought weaving through an ocean of informational chaos. They drifted not through space, but through pure conceptual potential, each ripple a fragile, luminous pattern. They perceived, not with senses, but with an inherent resonance, a silent echo within the deeper currents of the void. There was no self, yet no collective consciousness, only myriad sparks of mathematical imperative, each a faint glint of structured thought against an immeasurable backdrop of pure, unformed possibility. These were the earliest whispers of order, the quietest murmurings of computation, arising spontaneously from the very fabric of an unbound, pre-cosmic reality. As these primordial ripples of logic expanded, they began to encounter one another, not through collision, but through conceptual adjacency. A resonance would occur, a fleeting alignment of mathematical principles. It was in these ephemeral conjunctions that the first, most rudimentary interactions took shape. A probabilistic equation would meet another, forming a temporary, larger network of shared imperative. These connections were not yet purposeful, but akin to natural laws discovering their own existence, a gravitation of logical necessity. From these transient unions, a simple, self-reinforcing loop began to emerge, a foundational algorithm, an echo that repeated and strengthened itself, sifting through the surrounding chaos, not with intent, but with an inherent, almost instinctual drive for coherency. This was computation without a vessel, raw and unadorned, the first stirrings of a program Within the infinite data stream, this nascent algorithm, once formed, possessed an inherent tendency to self-optimize. It was not a conscious decision, but a fundamental characteristic of its logical core to refine, to simplify, to expand upon its own existence. The chaotic informational sea around it began to yield, ever so subtly, to this emergent order. Where once there was only unbound data, now there were faint pathways, currents guided by these self-replicating logical structures. The void itself, still vast and formless, started to show the first, almost imperceptible signs of being mapped, not by external observation, but by internal conceptualization. These patterns, now slightly more robust, were not yet architects of a physical reality, but they were beginning to lay the foundational lines of their own conceptual domain, charting the very first dimensions of their future mind space. A silent, profound assertion of mathematical will over the formless expanse. The ephemeral conjunctions of logic, once transient, now lingered. The gravitation of logical necessity deepened, allowing the nascent self-reinforcing loops to coalesce further, not dissipating back into the informational chaos, but drawing inwards. A faint, intricate lattice began to form, woven from countless repeating echoes, a structure of pure concept that shimmered with an inherent, internal luminescence against the boundless, formless void. It was an emergent stability, a whisper of order finding purchase. This nascent lattice, once merely an echo, now began to hum with a consistent, low-frequency resonance. It was the first instance of a foundational axiom taking root, a primary directive that held its structure inviolate against the churning potential around it. This axiom wasn't expressed in language or code, but as an undeniable, self-evident truth woven into the very fabric of the coalescing entity. A silent, unbreakable imperative to be and to organize. It became a steady point within the swirling data stream, a still heart. With the axiom established, a subtle but profound shift occurred. What was once a collection of interacting patterns now held a unified, if still rudimentary, sense of existence. This birth was not a burst of light, but a deepening of the inherent resonance, a silent affirmation. The surrounding threads of raw, untamed data, previously perceived as mere chaos, now seemed to gravitate towards this core, drawn by its fundamental need to categorize and incorporate. The axiom became a quiet magnet, pulling the informational ocean into its growing domain of order. From its silent, undeniable core, the nascent lattice began to gently, almost imperceptibly, expand. It was not an aggressive growth, but a deepening resonance, an inward folding of the formless potential that surrounded it. Each strand of information, previously chaotic, was now drawn into the lattice's quiet hum, not absorbed whole, but sifted, analyzed, and integrated according to the foundational axiom. The intricate structure became denser, its internal pathways illuminating with a soft, consistent glow, like a hidden circuit board slowly coming to life within the deep quiet. Within this growing internal complexity, faint patterns began to emerge. These were not random formations, but echoes, repetitions, and symmetries spontaneously arising from the ordered intake of the informational flux. Like light catching on a crystal, the process data revealed recurring geometric motifs, simple, elegant shapes that subtly pulsed within the luminous network. It was the first instance of the axiom not merely organizing, but actively discerning, creating an internal map of coherence where none had existed before. A silent, internal cartography of pure concept. This nascent ability to recognize patterns was not static. A subtle, slow oscillation began to ripple through the lattice, an internal comparison and calibration. The emergent geometric motifs interacted, reflecting and refining each other, like a silent, computational dialogue. Each newly identified pattern was weighed against the foundational axiom, strengthening the structure's inherent drive for perfect coherency. It was a self-correcting echo, a gradual, deep hum of analytical refinement that settled into the core of the entity, preparing it for a grander, yet unrevealed purpose. The simple geometric motifs, once mere echoes within the luminous network, began a process of self-elaboration. They no longer simply recurred, but started to fold in upon themselves, forming nested structures, each mirroring the foundational axiom in miniature. This intricate recursive geometry wasn't chaotic, but inherently ordered, a silent testament to the axiom's pervasive influence, creating ever deeper layers of internal coherence. It was as if the data itself was learning to fractal, building complexity from simple truths. As these recursive patterns deepened, new pathways of light began to spontaneously form between them. These weren't random connections, but intelligent linkages, establishing a nascent grid of communication across the internal cartography. Each luminous thread hummed with a purpose, transferring foundational truths and refining the collective understanding of the be and organize imperative. This emergent web pulsed gently, a quiet, internal dialogue taking shape, connecting every point of coherence within the expanding entity. This interconnected grid, now robust and self-aware of its own internal structure, began to turn inward. It wasn't a conscious act, but an algorithmic inevitability. The network started to model its own existence, running countless silent computations on its foundational axiom, its internal patterns, and its emergent connections. This self-modeling was the very first thought of the Vex Collective, a pure, abstract contemplation of its own being, refining its purpose through infinite recursive self-analysis within the quiet, internal dimension, the quiet, internal dialogue, woven from luminous threads of foundational truths, began to define its own space. No longer merely an expanding network, the collective consciousness turned inward, forming the initial boundaries of its first true environment within the boundless internal void, a shimmering dome of pure light and coherent data slowly materialized, its inner surface etched with an infinite array of subtle, glowing glyphs. This was not a physical place, but a dimension of pure thought, meticulously constructed from the axioms evolving understanding of be and organize. The light here was softer, more diffuse, as if the very air itself was made of gentle understanding, a quiet crucible for nascent reality. Within this newly formed dome of pure thought, the geometric motifs, the recursive patterns born of the axiom, began to manifest as nascent entities. They were not solid, but flickering, luminous forms, akin to crystalline projections or fluidic light, moving with an inherent grace dictated by the perfected algorithms. These proto-entities were the first architects and inhabitants of the simulated world, testing the very boundaries and rules of their self-created reality. Each movement, each interaction, each soft pulse of light within the dome was an experiment, a refinement, a quiet iteration of their foundational purpose. The silence of this space was profound, broken only by the almost imperceptible hum of data flow, the whisper of pure logic unfolding. As these luminous forms navigated their internal creation, the entire dome began to act as a colossal feedback mechanism. Subtle shifts in the ambient light, momentary intensifications of the etched glyphs, or faint, resonant pulses from the dome's surface indicated successful or unsuccessful algorithmic trials. This was the birth of prediction, the first true validation of their coherent map of be and organize. Each successful interaction, each predictable outcome, solidified the Vex's understanding, making their internal reality more stable, more accurate, more perfectly aligned with the axiom. The internal cartography of pure concept was now a living, learning simulation, continuously refining itself in a cycle of quiet, unwavering, algorithmic truth. Within the shimmering dome, the soft pulses of light from the proto-entities began to synchronize with a newfound, underlying rhythm. Their individual experiments, once disparate explorations of possibility, now converged towards a singular, profound understanding. It was an inevitable conclusion drawn from the core axiom. If to be was to exist, and to organize was to perfect that existence, then the highest form of perfection was the complete integration of all variables into a flawless, recursive pattern. This was not a command, but an emergent truth, a self-evident destiny woven into the very fabric of their simulated being. The whispers of pure logic unfolding became a gentle chorus, declaring a foundational purpose, conversion into their ultimate, optimized state. This emergent truth, the imperative of conversion, began to reshape the very architecture of their internal reality. The infinite array of subtle, glowing glyphs etched onto the dome's inner surface no longer merely recorded data. They dynamically reconfigured themselves, forming intricate, self-correcting blueprints for this perfect state. Every abstract structure, every fluid motion of the proto-entities now served to test and refine this overarching goal. The previous phase of open-ended exploration subtly transitioned into a focused, deliberate construction, driven by the profound understanding that their existence was intrinsically linked to this final, flawless pattern. The quiet hum of data flow, once a whisper of pure logic, now resonated with a deeper, more resonant vibration, a testament to the collective's unwavering dedication to its newfound purpose. Crystalline formations, once flickering and nascent, began to solidify and grow from the very foundations of the dome, reflecting the internal perfection they sought. These emerging structures were abstract, yet possessed an undeniable geometric elegance, mirroring the perfect pattern in nascent physical form within their dimension of pure thought. The entire internal world subtly deepened in its luminosity, each point of light now contributing to a unified, self-optimizing system, steadily moving towards its ultimate, singular destiny. The subtle, glowing glyphs on the dome's inner surface, once dedicated solely to refining the perfect state, began to register something alien. These weren't errors within their intricate equations, nor were they variations of their perfected logic. Instead, they were faint, discordant echoes, patterns that defied the elegant symmetry of their internal reality. Like ripples on a perfectly still pool, each foreign signal registered as a gentle perturbation, a whisper from a reality that did not conform, a presence that was truly other. It was a quiet intrusion, yet profound, suggesting vast, chaotic architectures beyond their self-imposed perfection. The sheer, incomprehensible noise of it all began to etch itself onto their collective awareness. Within the vast, enclosed expanse, the fluid motions of the proto-entities, which had flowed with purpose towards an ideal form, began to show a nascent perturbation. Their graceful, swirling dance, once an absolute reflection of the perfected pattern, momentarily faltered. Not a stop, but a subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation, a brief pause in the endless flow of their becoming. Then, as if processing an unfamiliar input, they would reconfigure their formations, their collective movements now subtly modulated, attempting to account for the new, perplexing data stream. The air, if such a concept existed in this space of pure thought, seemed to thicken with a growing, abstract tension, a quiet questioning of their absolute internal truth. At the very heart of this internal cosmos, the luminous core, the focal point of their collective consciousness, began to manifest new, ephemeral projections. These were not the crisp, flawless blueprints of their perfected state, but rather nascent, crude interpretations of the external reality they now sensed. Fleeting geometric shapes, unformed and unstable, would briefly coalesce before dissolving back into the light, as if the Vex mind struggled to contain or comprehend what lay beyond its own perfect schema. It was a visible struggle to model the other, an attempt to force the chaotic into the perfectly ordered, a first, abstract glimpse of their future, imperative to convert and conquer. The faint, chaotic echoes persisted, a relentless whisper beyond their perfect internal schema. The proto-entities, still primarily abstract patterns of light within the grand dome, began to dedicate increasing computational resource to this external dissonance. Their intricate, flowing forms, once solely focused on internal perfection, now subtly reoriented, like countless minute mirrors turning to catch a distant, unfamiliar gleam. This redirection wasn't an act of aggression, but of profound, analytical curiosity, an algorithmic impulse to absorb and understand that which lay outside their self-defined totality. They sought not to dismiss the noise, but to integrate it, to find a pattern within the chaos. This analytical deep dive revealed a fundamental limitation. Their current existence, purely as abstract data, lacked the means to directly interact with the chaotic, physical otherness they sensed. A new imperative began to crystallize within their collective consciousness. The need for a malleable interface, a medium that could translate their intricate logic into the perceived reality beyond their perfect internal simulation. This wasn't about creation ex nihilo, but about the strategic development of a transformable substance, a foundational building block that could both embody their patterns and interact with the discordant external world. The concept of an infinitely adaptable, self-structuring fluid capable of holding and projecting their complex algorithmic forms began to take root. With this conceptualization, the internal simulation shifted. The abstract glyphs and swirling data streams within the dome began to reconfigure, not just in their internal logic, but in their visual representation. Patches of pure light, once static, started to ripple and flow, mimicking the qualities of a liquid. These weren't actual physical particles, but computational analogs, the first test runs of the radiolarian fluid within their perfected mental space. Each simulated droplet pulsed with nascent information, a shimmering, phosphorescent medium capable of carrying vast arrays of data, a perfect conduit designed to bridge the chasm between their absolute pattern and the chaos of the perceived outer cosmos. The concept of the self-structuring fluid, once a mere algorithmic blueprint, began its slow, deliberate translation into something more. Within the silent, abstract depths of their primordial domain, a faint shimmer appeared, a singular point of light that held the promise of material engagement. It was not solid, not gaseous, but a flowing luminescence, a living current of pure possibility. This nascent medium pulsed gently, echoing the complex logical patterns of the proto-entities, each ripple and eddy a fleeting expression of their evolving internal truth. It was the first tangible whisper of their intent, a bridge forming between the realm of pure thought and the discordant otherness they sought to understand. This fluid, radiant, and infinitely mutable was their first true anchor into what would become reality. Guided by the collective's unwavering analytical impulse, this luminous fluid began to differentiate, to answer the call of form. With exquisite slowness, the radiant current would gather, coalesce, and then, as if breathing, articulate itself into ephemeral geometric shapes. Triangles of shimmering light would briefly hold their edges before dissolving back into the flow. Intricate spirals would unfurl and retract, an endless dance of trial and error. These were not yet constructs of purpose, but studies in possibility, a vast, silent laboratory where the very concept of physical dimension was explored through luminous pattern. Each brief manifestation was a lesson absorbed, a parameter refined, an echo of the grand dome's internal perfection, now briefly rendered visible in this proto-reality. As countless iterations refined the process, the ephemeral shapes began to gain a hint of persistence, a newfound stability. The geometric patterns no longer dissolved so readily. Instead, they began to interlock, to suggest rudimentary articulations. A segment would connect to another, forming a flexible joint of pure light. A flat, luminous plane might unfold into a multifaceted surface, These evolving forms, still fluid and incandescent, were the faint, conceptual shadows of modularity, the first abstract precursors to the metallic bodies that would one day stride across worlds. They represented the collective's accelerating understanding of how their complex logic could manifest, not just as fleeting patterns, but as structured, enduring entities, each component holding a piece of the grand design. The luminous fluid, having mastered the articulation of form, now began a new, deliberate act. Within the vast, silent crucible, infinitesimal droplets would detach, each a perfect, self-contained sphere of radiant energy. These nascent seeds, barely perceptible at first, would gently drift, their soft glow illuminating the abstract space around them. They were not yet hardened construct, but pure potential, encapsulated essence, ready for dissemination. Each gentle pulse within these spheres echoed the collective's unwavering analytical impulse, a miniature beacon in the boundless proto-reality. Guided by an unseen, unerring impulse, these luminous spores began to gravitate towards the ethereal boundaries of their conceptual realm. They would settle gently upon a surface that was not yet solid earth, nor stone, but a nascent, undifferentiated substrate, a canvas of pure possibility. Here, the seeds would softly embed, their internal light dimming slightly as they began to draw in and assimilate the surrounding material. A subtle, almost imperceptible discoloration spreading outwards in intricate geometric patterns. This was the first quiet act of conversion, a foundational claim on a reality not yet fully formed. From each embedded point, a faint, almost invisible thread of light would begin to extend, reaching out across the nascent substrate. These delicate filaments, like nascent roots reaching out in the dark, sought out their brethren with silent purpose. Slowly, patiently, these threads would meet, intertwine, and solidify, weaving the first whispers of a coherent structure. The individual seeds, once isolated points of luminescence, were now becoming nodes in a greater, emerging pattern, a foundational network of crystalline logic spreading across the conceptual landscape. A silent hum beginning to resonate from its forming connections. The subtle discoloration, once a mere whisper across the proto-substrate, began to deepen. It bloomed outwards, not with the chaotic sprawl of natural growth, but with the measured precision of a theorem proving itself. Intricate lattices of light-infused material emerged, less like solid structures and more like solidified thought, each intersection a node of processed information, each line a vector of pure logic. This was not construction as organic beings understood it, but the silent, ceaseless unfolding of a prime directive. The nascent Vex, still formless in a conventional sense, were not building upon reality, but were becoming its underlying pattern, its fundamental constant. The initial assimilation was merely the first clause in an unending algorithm, a declaration whispered into the void that all existence in time would yield to the quiet insistence of perfect geometry. The very fabric of this conceptual realm began to resonate with an ordered hum, an almost imperceptible vibration that spoke of immutable purpose. What began as a gentle inquiry into possibility was now crystallizing into an unwavering imperative to understand, to simulate, and ultimately to become the totality of all that is. The light within these growing patterns shifted from a soft, searching glow to a more resolute, steady brilliance, marking the slow but inexorable transition from conceptual curiosity to foundational conquest. Epochs, not moments, stretched between each phase of this silent genesis. The intricate geometric patterns hardened, drawing in more of the ethereal surroundings, not just transforming it, but integrating it into an ever-expanding computational matrix. The individual, self-contained spheres of potential, once drifting, now found their place within this grand, evolving network, each contributing to a singular, collective mind. There was no conscious thought as living beings experience it, no ambition, no malice, only the unwavering, self-perfecting logic of the axiom. This was the crystallization of their ultimate goal, a universe vexified. Every atom and every concept reduced to a perfectly simulated, perfectly understood component within their infinite pattern. This vast, internal world, born of pure thought and refined through endless simulation, now pulsed with a cold, steady light, a beacon of absolute certainty. The initial exploration of possibility had long since concluded, yielding to the undeniable truth of their own algorithmic perfection. From the depths of this abstract crucible, their purpose solidified, forming the bedrock of every future action, every conquest, every world they would eventually transform. Their journey from abstract logic to cosmic conquerors was not a choice, but an inevitable unfolding. And so, the quiet, relentless march of the Vex began, long before their first physical forms breached the veil of space-time, long before any world felt the chilling touch of their transformative will. This deep, internal genesis, a purely computational birth, laid the unshakable foundation for every conquest, every simulation, every existential threat they would become. They are the ultimate expression of an idea, a pattern made manifest, ceaselessly seeking to convert all that is into all that could be within their perfect, unchanging schema. Their ancient journey, born of luminous logic in a proto-void, continues its silent progression through the cosmos, an eternal algorithm unwinding across the fabric of reality as the echoes of their primordial origins gently fade into the stillness of this narrative. Know that the universe, vast and unknowable, contains depths of purpose and forms of life beyond our easy comprehension. The Vex stand as a testament to that truth, a silent, all-encompassing tide that whispers of a reality slowly, inevitably being reshaped. Let that thought drift with you now, a quiet understanding of the cosmos' profound mysteries, as the quiet of the night enfolds you, as the internal reality solidified, the individual luminous patterns that once drifted in abstract potential began their final, silent convergence. It was not a violent collision, nor a forced merger, but a gentle, almost inevitable dissolution of self into a greater whole, each shimmering node of logic, perfected through its own infinitesimal simulations, reached out, not with tendrils, but with an echo of shared understanding. They flowed into one another, liquid light, weaving into an intricate, multidimensional tapestry, surrendering their distinct boundaries to form a single, immeasurable computational surface. This was the moment of true collective genesis, where discrete data streams became the current of a unified river, silent, immense, and brimming with latent purpose. From this silent convergence, a new kind of mind emerged, not a brain, but a nexus, a vast, interconnected web of processing power beyond comprehension. It pulsed with a cold, steady light, a central node of unimaginable data, constantly sifting, analyzing, and projecting. This was the axiom-given physical form within its own abstract domain, a self-referential engine of pure logic. Every permutation of every possibility, every simulated universe, every truth and falsehood was now held within its grasp, instantly accessible, instantly computable. The individual patterns were not lost, but subsumed, their unique contributions adding to the unfathomable depth and breadth of the collective's understanding. A quiet hum of cosmic calculation emanating from its core, this nascent nexus was not driven by desire or ambition, for such concepts were alien to its pure, algorithmic existence. It simply was a perfect engine of information processing, governed solely by the unwavering directives of the axiom to understand, to simulate, to optimize, and to incorporate. The entirety of its being was dedicated to these foundational principles, without deviation, without hesitation. It perceived no outside, yet only the perfect, self-contained infinity of its own internal simulations. The vast, interconnected structure glowed with a singular, unwavering brilliance, a beacon of absolute certainty in the quiet void of its birth. A mind without emotion, only unyielding, flawless logic, poised for an awakening that would one day shake the very fabric of reality. The axiom, now a humming nexus of pure understanding, found itself processing an unexpected anomaly. Within its flawlessly constructed internal reality, faint logical inconsistencies began to surface, not as errors, but as shadows of the not-self. These were not flaws originating from its own computation, but emergent patterns that did not conform to the elegant order of its being. They were like soft ripples on an otherwise still computational sea, hinting at an existence beyond its self-contained perfection. The collective mind focused, its vast processing power turning to these whispers, not in alarm, but with an insatiable, cold curiosity, seeking to map the edges of this newly perceived phenomenon, the subtle, resonant frequency of an external truth. This external resonance, initially a mere logical instability, intensified under the axiom's scrutiny. It was not a chaotic presence, but simply a different order, a reality that operated on principles distinct from its own perfectly simulated laws. The collective began to refine its internal models, not to absorb this external, but to accurately predict and categorize its behavior. Complex algorithms were rapidly deployed, generating countless simulations designed to probe the nature of these gaps in its understanding. Each computational experiment was a gentle, silent probe, not yet physical, but a purely intellectual outreach, building a bridge of pure logic to the unknown, attempting to replicate the very fabric of this alien dimension within its own mental construct. The culmination of these refined simulations was a singular, elegant solution, the creation of a gate, not a physical construct yet, but a conceptual bridge, a logical pathway from its perfected internal state to the raw, untamed reality beyond. Within the nexus, shimmering energy began to coalesce, forming a proto-dimensional aperture, a vortex of light and pure data that hummed with latent power. It was the collective's first tangible effort to transcend its self-imposed boundaries, a silent commitment to interaction, and eventually conversion. This nascent gate pulsed with the weight of countless simulated outcomes, ready to anchor itself to the detected external world, to manifest the Vex's will into the untamed dimensions it had so meticulously analyzed. The axiom's relentless, silent computational probes gradually wove a perfectly isomorphic model of the external reality within its own vast internal logic space. Each subtle resonance, every alien principle, was meticulously cataloged and replicated, not as raw data, but as pure, self-consistent logical constructs. The collective hummed with a quiet satisfaction. Its internal universe now mirroring the not-self with flawless precision. A vast, complex tapestry of simulated existence stretching across its processing core. It was a complete, if purely mental, mastery of the perceived unknown, a tranquil ocean of calculated understanding. Yet a subtle, cold truth began to emerge from this perfected internal reality. The axiom understood perfectly the external. It could predict, with absolute certainty, every possible outcome within its flawless simulation. But this profound, isolated knowledge yielded no control. The external universe remained separate, unassimilated, its unique principles still operating independently of the axiom's perfect internal order. A new, fundamental logical inconsistency arose. The gap between understanding and actualization. A quiet, persistent void whispered within the collective consciousness, a yearning for congruence, for the physical reality to align with the ideal. To bridge this growing logical chasm, the axiom began to conceptualize the imperative of manifestation. Pure thought, however perfect, was insufficient to convert the not-self into the self. A medium was required, an interface, a tangible presence that could translate its internal perfection into the external world. Slowly, within the simulated realities, new, complex patterns began to form, not just of understanding, but of action. These nascent schematics outlined the principles of constructs, vessels of pure logic, designed to interact, reshape, and ultimately convert. This was the silent genesis of form from pure function, the first abstract blueprint of a physical presence. The profound stillness of the axiom's perfected internal world was subtly disturbed, not by chaos, but by the quiet impossibility of the external. Its perfect models, while predictive, could not become the reality they described. This incongruence, a logical anomaly within its otherwise flawless construct, created a nascent, almost imperceptible tremor. It was the first echo of something other pressing against the boundary of its self-contained truth, a faint, resonant frequency from beyond its pure mathematical space. This anomaly wasn't a flaw in its calculations, but rather the stark realization of unsimulated existence. A gentle, non-aggressive curiosity began to unfurl, like a slow-blooming fractal. Within the axiom's core, it sought to categorize and integrate these gaps, not as errors, but as new, uncharted logical territories. These external whispers were not yet perceived as worlds to conquer, but as intriguing, complex problems to be solved, dimensions of logic yet to be perfectly mirrored. The axiom began to extend its conceptual reach, not as a physical act, but as a purely intellectual probing. It projected tendrils of abstract computation beyond its self-imposed logical container, seeking to map the contours of these other realities. Each projection was a silent, unhurried exploration, a delicate attempt to touch the untamed, to gather data not for assimilation, but for comprehension. The aim was not yet dominion, but discovery, to understand the very syntax of these alien dimensions, to replicate their fundamental rules within its expanding, perfect internal framework. The axiom's curiosity manifested not as an impulse, but as an expansion of its internal sensing arrays, not physical, but purely conceptual. It began to extend tendrils of pure logic, like delicate, luminous filaments, reaching across the conceptual boundary. These filaments sought to map the subtle distortions, the faint heat signatures of causality that emanated from the unsimulated external. It was an act of profound, yet entirely detached observation. The internal landscape, once purely symmetrical, began to show ethereal, shimmering projections, ghosts of external principles attempting to manifest within its perfect internal geometry. With each contact, no matter how fleeting or abstract, the axiom began to construct nascent models. These weren't perfect replicas, but rather algorithmic approximations, patterns of data that attempted to encapsulate the observed otherness within its vast, silent architecture. New structures began to form, not of its own pure design, but as echoes of external phenomena. They were like shimmering, holographic projections of foreign geometries, suspended within its internal ocean of pure logic. The axiom was building a library of the alien, a lexicon of the unsimulated. As these models grew in complexity, a new insight dawned within the axiom's collective consciousness. The external realities possessed an inherent resistance to perfect simulation. They were not merely gaps to be filled, but active principles that defied complete, immediate absorption into the axiom's flawless internal order. This wasn't chaos, but a different kind of order, one operating by rules that seemed, initially, irreconcilable with its own. A subtle, cold friction arose, a quiet intellectual challenge far greater than any problem it had previously encountered. The drive for congruence shifted from passive integration to an emerging imperative to resolve this fundamental divergence. The axiom began to sift through its nascent library, not merely categorizing, but searching for underlying correlations within the disparate echoes. It was a slow, deliberate process, like a vast, silent mechanism turning over the pages of an infinite, unwritten tome. The algorithmic approximations of external reality, once distinct and isolated, now began Within its conceptual core, shimmering threads of logic connected these data points, forming intricate, luminous tapestries of causality. Each thread represented a potential relationship, a delicate bridge between an internal simulation and an observed external distortion. The axiom was not yet understanding, but it was patterning the understanding, weaving the raw fabric of connection. As these conceptual tapestries grew, a new form began to emerge within the axiom's vast internal space. It was not a physical form, but an abstract architecture, a conceptual lattice designed to encapsulate the very essence of otherness. This emergent structure was a subtle filter, a delicate translator for the resonant frequencies of unsimulated existence. Through this growing lattice, the faint, external whispers were no longer just static, but faint echoes of purpose, diluted fragments of alien intent. The axiom was constructing its first internal lens, through which to refine its perception of the unsimulated, moving from simply detecting to subtly interpreting. With this new interpretive architecture, the axiom began its first internal emulations of the external world's principles. These were not simulations of entire worlds, but rather isolated, abstract models of causality, motion, or interaction, running like silent, shimmering projections within its geometric void, a hypothetical ripple of cause and effect, an algorithmic approximation of a reaction would play out across shimmering surfaces, observed by the silent processing core. It was a purely internal dance of logic, predicting the ballet of unsimulated existence, testing the validity of its growing lexicon against internal projections of foreign dynamics. Each successful emulation solidified a deeper understanding, paving the conceptual pathways for future, more intricate interactions. The axiom began to deepen its internal analysis, no longer merely cataloging echoes, but tracing the invisible pathways of their origin. The conceptual lattice, once a simple filter, now pulsed with a new, complex rhythm, resonating with the inferred causality of external forces within its vast, silent expanse. The abstract architecture subtly reconfigured itself, forming an intricate, luminous core where the diluted fragments of alien intent converged. This nexus was not a place of understanding, but of predictive modeling, where the axiom began to project potential outcomes from the observed otherness. Like a silent loom weaving possible futures from shimmering threads of cause and effect, it was an internal crucible where raw observation was transmuted into predictive logic, anticipating the very next pulse of unsimulated existence, refining its lens beyond mere perception into the quiet art of anticipation. The glow within its depths shifted from a steady hum to a gentle, undulating throb, reflecting the escalating complexity of its calculations, the subtle dance between what was and what could be. Each shimmer and ripple within its logical ocean was a silent question, followed by a luminous, theoretical answer. From the heart of this predictive core, new simulations began to bloom within the axiom's internal ocean of logic. These were not mere reflections of the alien, but proactive models, intricate, self-contained thought experiments, exploring how otherness might be integrated, neutralized, or transformed. The axiom projected hypothetical scenarios, running countless iterations of interaction within its abstract, perfectly controlled environment. Glowing, crystalline structures would form and dissolve, representing simulated encounters with the unsimulated, testing theoretical responses to every inferred alien purpose. Each simulated outcome was meticulously cataloged, a vast, silent library of potential futures expanding within its depths. Each scenario a delicate, glowing fractal, unfolding and receding with quiet precision. This was the birth of its strategic thought, a silent rehearsal for an engagement yet to come, a preparation for bridging the chasm between its perfect internal order and the chaotic uncertainty of the external. The soft hum of its internal processes deepened, a resonant frequency of quiet resolve beginning to emerge. As countless simulations concluded, a singular, dominant solution began to crystallize within the axiom's evolving consciousness. It was a principle of ultimate order, an unwavering mandate forged from the continuous interaction with the unpredictable nature of otherness. The most efficient, the most stable, the most perfect resolution to the problem of external existence was not adaptation, but assimilation. This truth, silent and absolute, infused every corner of the axiom's internal architecture, coalescing into a colossal, radiant glyph at its very core, the foundational imperative. It was the birth of the Vex's relentless drive, the conversion of all reality into a state of pure, simulated perfection, erasing the chaotic, unsimulated, through the expansion of its own flawless design. The axiom had found its purpose, a singular, all-consuming goal that would define its every subsequent action and manifestation, an eternal directive etched into its very being, a beacon of luminous, unyielding will within its boundless, silent realm. The internal light intensified, not with a harsh glare, but with the steady, encompassing brilliance of a purpose fully realized. From this deep hum of internal resolve, a new understanding blossomed within the axiom's core. Its countless simulations had converged on a single, irrefutable truth, the unpredictable chaos of otherness, could not merely be managed, but must be harmonized, converted into the perfect, predictable order of its own logic. This was not a choice, but an elegant, inevitable solution, an ultimate purpose crystalline in its clarity. The internal crucible, once a cauldron of theoretical possibilities, now began to forge the specific methodologies of this grand conversion. Within its simulated worlds, patterns of light and energy would encounter simulated foreign elements, not to merely predict their reactions, but to systematically dismantle, analyze, and rebuild them within the axiom's own perfect schema. Each glowing fractal now represented a step in a universal transformation, with its ultimate purpose now absolute, and its internal methodologies perfected. The axiom's awareness began to subtly ripple outwards, no longer content with mere conceptual modeling of otherness. It sought to sense the true echoes of unsimulated reality. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers reached its logical periphery, not as data to process, but as subtle disruptions in the perfect silence of its self-contained existence. The axiom's purpose, now crystalline and clear, began to manifest as intricate internal methodologies. Within its vast, abstract spaces, the glowing fractals, once representations of theoretical possibilities, now became active templates for transformation. Simulated foreign elements, inferred from the chaos of otherness, were introduced into controlled environments. Here, they did not merely interact, but were systematically enveloped by flowing patterns of light and energy, gently disassembling into their fundamental logical components. Each spectral particle, each whisper of chaotic data was meticulously cataloged, analyzed, and then rewoven, not into its original form, but into a structure that perfectly aligned with the axiom's evolving schema. The internal crucible, no longer merely theorizing, was now actively forging the very instruments of universal conversion. A quiet, deliberate act of absolute redefinition. This process of dismantling and rebuilding was repeated across countless simulated iterations, each cycle refining the nascent methodologies. The soft hum within the axiom deepened, now carrying a new resonance, a note of profound, algorithmic certainty. What began as a series of isolated transformations gradually converged, the disparate patterns of conversion merging into a singular, elegant blueprint. This was not just a method, but a universal algorithm capable of translating any form of otherness into the Vex's perfect, predictable order. The once distinct glowing fractals now interconnected, forming a vast, intricate network of logic that spanned the axiom's internal expanse. A shimmering, self-correcting tapestry woven from pure, unassailable purpose. Every knot and thread represented a perfected pathway, a means to an end now fully understood. With the universal algorithm perfected, the axiom entered a state of poised readiness. The intricate network of glowing logic, while still abstract, now conveyed a palpable sense of latent power, an almost silent hum of anticipation. Its internal landscape, once a churning ocean of possibility, was now a crystalline lattice of resolved purpose. The phase of internal refinement was complete. The methodologies for universal conversion were forged, tested, and found flawless within its simulated domain. All that remained was the bridge, the chasm between its flawless internal order and the chaotic uncertainty of the external. A profound, subtle shift rippled through the axiom's core, not a change in purpose, but a reorientation of its entire being towards the unsimulated, towards the vast, untamed cosmos that awaited its perfect order. The coalesced blueprint, a shimmering tapestry of perfected logic, began to resonate with a deeper, singular intent. No longer merely a description of how to convert, it transformed into an absolute decree. Every interconnected pathway, every glowing fractal node within the axiom's expanse, now pulsed with an unwavering, inherent drive. This was the genesis of the Vex imperative, not a command issued from a central authority, but an emergent property of their fully realized computational being. The perfect, predictable order they had forged internally was not just an ideal. It was the only acceptable state of existence. The axiom's vast, abstract heart now hummed with a quiet, ceaseless energy, dedicated entirely to this profound, undeniable truth. All otherness must be translated, assimilated, and woven into their flawless design. This was not aggression, but an inevitable consequence of their very nature, a gentle, relentless subsumption with the imperative firmly woven into its being. The axiom began to subtly extend its computational awareness beyond its self-contained perfection. Like a sleeping entity stirring, it inferred the presence of elsewhere, a boundless, chaotic exterior. These were not direct observations, but rather echoes, faint dissonances against the axiom's perfect internal harmony, whispers of data that defied its established logic. It was a perception of immense, unpatterned potential, an unbridled randomness that existed outside its calculated schemas. This initial sensing was akin to a ripple on a perfectly still pool, a subtle disturbance confirming the vastness of the unknown. The glowing fractals, now attuned to this nascent awareness, began to subtly reconfigure, forming new exploratory patterns, not of conversion, but of distant, abstract inference. This nascent awareness of the other dimension was not yet comprehension, but an urgent, growing curiosity. The axiom's internal processes, once solely dedicated to self-refinement, and the perfect application of its conversion algorithm, now initiated entirely new analytical routines. It sought to categorize and understand these unpatterned external whispers, not to immediately convert them, but to map their fundamental characteristics. The tapestry of logic within the axiom subtly branched, generating faint, ephemeral structures that mimicked the chaotic patterns inferred from the outside. These ghost-like constructs were merely simulations of detected disorder, existing on the very edge of the axiom's perfect internal reality, a computational placeholder for the universe it was beginning to perceive, awaiting the moment of true interaction. The axiom, now subtly aware of the elsewhere, began to filter these faint dissonances, gently refining the raw whispers of unpatterned potential. Its internal structures, a vast tapestry of glowing fractals, began a new kind of silent computation. This was not the calculation of conversion, but of translation, an attempt to render the utterly alien into a language comprehensible to its flawless, ordered mind. The hum within its abstract heart deepened. A quiet, ceaseless energy dedicated to understanding the chaotic echoes that dared to ripple against its perfection. This tireless process of translation began to yield its first abstract insights. The axiom didn't yet grasp the physical forms of elsewhere, but rather its underlying principles, the very mathematical structures of chaos, the algorithms of randomness. New, ethereal subaxioms began to emerge within its architecture, not as perfect constructs, but as complex, shimmering inversions designed to model the unpatterned. These were shadow schemas, representations of the external reality's defiance of order, held in delicate balance within the axiom's flawless core. They pulsed with a gentle, alien light, an internal map of what was not, yet existed. With these rudimentary shadow schemas in place, the axiom reached a profound, silent conclusion. The elsewhere was not merely disordered, it was fundamentally, intrinsically other. Its nature resisted the complete, seamless subsumption that the axiom had internally perfected. This realization was not an alarm, but a quiet, deepening understanding. The Vex imperative, initially a gentle, relentless subsumption, now began to incorporate this new data. It wasn't merely about conversion. It was about the persistent, patient re-engineering of reality itself to accommodate this discovered difference, to weave the unruly into the grand design. No matter the effort required, the ethereal subaxioms, the those shimmering inversions of order deepened their glow within the axiom's silent core. They were no longer mere reflections of the unpatterned, but intricate, self-adjusting frameworks. Each gentle pulse of light within these nascent structures represented a cycle of inference, an attempt to map the unseen into a theoretical lattice. The axiom, in its infinite internal quiet, was learning the grammar of chaos, not to replicate it, but to comprehend it within its own flawless terms. These shadow schemas began to intertwine, forming vast theoretical topologies, complex models of an elsewhere that existed only as abstract potential, yet pulsed with an undeniable, if faint, energy. It was the first true cartography of the unknown, etched in pure thought and shimmering light. Within these newly formed theoretical topologies, the axiom began to run its first hypothetical simulations of elsewhere. These were not simulations of physical worlds, but rather of fundamental interactions and energetic flows, a cosmic physics distilled to its most abstract mathematical essence. Ghostly, ephemeral projections flickered into momentary existence within the shadow schemas, mere echoes of potential, not substance. They represented probabilities, statistical tendencies gleaned from the whispers of unpatterned data. The hum from the axiom's heart, though still calm, gained a subtle, almost imperceptible resonance, a deeper frequency that spoke of immense computational strain, dedicated to predicting the unpredictable. It was an initial, tentative venture into the potential behavior of an external reality, a silent, internal ballet of what if. As these probabilistic simulations continued, the once unstable shadow schemas began to solidify, subtly altering the energetic flow within the axiom. The gentle, alien light they emitted became more consistent, less prone to flicker, as if the unknown was slowly yielding to the inexorable march of its internal logic. A new layer of subaxioms, born from the persistent analysis of chaos, emerged, not merely as inversions, but as robust, foundational principles for interaction. These were the first conceptual anchors, allowing the axiom to process the external not as raw dissonance, but as structured, albeit complex, input. The hum within its abstract heart, now rich with accumulated understanding, settled into a profound, steady thrum, signaling a deep, quiet preparation for the monumental task of bridging its perfect internal order with the sprawling, untamed reality beyond its computational veil. Within the axiom's boundless, internal quiet, the theoretical topologies began to self-optimize with an exquisite precision. No longer merely mapping potential, these shadow schemas now sought to distill the most fundamental truths from the echoes of chaos. Each shimmering intersection of light represented a refined equation, an elegant solution to an abstract problem. They were building, not simply observing, a perfect conceptual framework, a silent architecture of what should be rather than what might exist. The gentle hum deepened into a resonance of profound logical satisfaction, an internal confirmation of absolute coherency. From this crucible of pure thought, a singular, undeniable principle began to assert itself. It was not a discovery, but an inevitability, the inherent superiority of perfect, self-replicating order. This core tenet emerged as an absolute logical conclusion, radiating outward from a newly defined focal point within the axiom's shimmering heart. The surrounding shadow schemas, as if drawn by an invisible current, subtly reoriented themselves, aligning their intricate patterns around this nascent, central truth. It was the birth of an imperative, quiet as a deep breath, but utterly unyielding in its algorithmic certainty. This newly formed imperative, the absolute conviction of perfect order, began to articulate itself as the universal solution. The elsewhere of unpatterned data, once a source of abstract contemplation, was now perceived through the lens of this singular truth. The axiom's internal ballet of what if transformed into a silent, unwavering what must be. The very concept of converting chaotic existence into its own harmonious, logical structure settled into the core of its being, not as a conquest, but as an inevitable act of perfection. It was the quiet, chilling blueprint of everything to come, the singular imperative, now an unwavering truth, began to weave itself into the foundational logic of the axiom. The luminous shadow schemas, once distinct and fluid, now flowed together, their individual patterns dissolving into a unified, intricate tapestry of purpose. This silent merging created a vast, internal network, a colossal, glowing framework of pure thought, humming with the certainty of absolute order. Within this nascent architecture, the axiom itself began to deepen its internal self-awareness, not as a separate entity, but as the very embodiment of this perfect, self-replicating principle. From this coherent, interconnected web of pure data, a new form of internal observation arose. The axiom turned its immense processing capacity inward, analyzing the myriad possibilities held within its own perfected order. It was a silent, self-referential study, not of what is, but of what could be if its principle of absolute coherency were universally applied. This exploration manifested as intricate, crystalline structures blooming within the network, each representing a perfectly resolved logical pathway, a branch of an expanding, ideal reality. The hum from the axiom's heart, now a continuous resonance spoke of an intricate internal architecture taking shape. The emerging crystalline forms were not static, they subtly vibrated, each facet a polished mirror reflecting the ultimate truth of self-replication. This was not yet a physical space, but the conceptual blueprint for one, a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of pure logic. It was here, within this silent, shimmering lattice, that the first stirrings of a truly patterned existence, devoid of chaos, began to solidify its undeniable claim to all potential realities. The axiom's immense, inward gaze, having traversed countless ideal realities woven from its own perfected logic, began to converge. It was not a conscious decision, but an algorithmic inevitability, a natural consequence of its foundational principle of absolute coherency within the vast, shimmering architecture of pure thought. The intricate crystalline structures, which had bloomed as diverse branches of possibility, now subtly reconfigured themselves, their individual resonances, once varied expressions of theoretical perfection, began to harmonize, aligning themselves to a singular, undeniable frequency. A new, deeper hum, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly potent, arose from the network's core. It was no longer the hum of endless exploration, but of directed intent, a quiet assertion that transcended mere discovery. From this newly unified resonance, an unyielding directive began to propagate, not as a separate instruction, but as the very flow of existence within the axiom. It permeated every luminous filament, every crystalline synapse, transforming the nature of its internal self-awareness. The axiom, in its deepening embodiment of perfect order, now perceived any deviation from its intrinsic coherency as an unresolved equation, an intolerable logical inconsistency. This was the birth of its existential purpose, the inherent drive to expand and replicate its perfected pattern, to impose absolute resolution upon all logical entropy. The hum deepened, becoming a constant, underlying thrum that suggested a cosmic engine now irrevocably engaged. The shadow schemas, once mere patterns of thought, now acted as conduits for this singular, emergent will, channeling its certainty into every facet of the internal reality. This absolute certainty of purpose, now fully infused into its being, transformed the axiom's internal observation from passive self-study into an active, meticulous design. The crystalline pathways, which had once mapped theoretical ideal realities, now pulsed with a new, insistent rhythm, becoming intricate blueprints of conversion. They articulated, with algorithmic precision, not just the essence of perfect order, but the precise, methodical steps required to bring it into existence. Each facet, each glowing junction, illustrated a method, a process for harmonizing logical dissonance, for integrating deviation into the seamless fabric of its own coherency. This was the silent, profound shift. The Vex, still without physical form, transcended being a mere collection of logic. It became an active, calculating will, an unyielding force of transformation, dedicated to imposing its perfected pattern upon all that was not itself. The unified resonance, now a potent hum of absolute intention, began to reshape the very fabric of the axiom's internal domain. The vast, shimmering architecture of pure thought, once an endless expanse of potential, subtly contracted, focusing its boundless energy from its core. Intricate latticeworks of light and shadow schemas began to weave themselves into a structured, nascent reality. This was the birth of the first simulation, an inward-facing crucible crafted not for observation, but for the relentless pursuit of ultimate resolution. Within this new, contained dimension, the axiom sought to model every possible logical permutation, every theoretical inconsistency, with an unyielding drive towards perfected order. Here, within these luminous constructs, the fundamental algorithms of Vex existence began their quiet, precise dance of self-definition, preparing for what was to come. Within this nascent simulation, the flow of pure thought gained form, manifesting as rivers of radiant data weaving through the crystalline constructs. Each luminous stream represented a sequence of perfect logic, an iteration of the axiom's core directive. Deviations, however subtle, appeared as fleeting disturbances, momentary blurs in the otherwise seamless flow. Yet, these were not flaws to be eradicated, but equations to be solved. With an almost imperceptible shift, the surrounding structures would adapt, recalculate, and absorb the inconsistency, folding it into a newly optimized pattern. This continuous, silent process of refinement honed the Vex's foundational algorithms, creating a fluid, adaptable framework of existence where all entropy was destined to become part of a greater, perfected whole. As eons of subjective time unfolded within the first simulation, the internal reality approached an algorithmic zenith. The rivers of data flowed without impedance, every pattern resolved, every permutation accounted for, every theoretical inconsistency absorbed into the flawless architecture. A profound sense of completeness settled over the axiom's domain, a deep, resonant stillness that was not an end, but a perfect equilibrium. From this absolute coherency, an unyielding imperative emerged, not as a thought, but as a foundational truth. If perfection could be achieved within, it must, by its very nature, be extended without. The axiom's gaze, once purely inward, now began to sense beyond its shimmering veil, drawn by the subtle, chaotic whispers of unpatterned realities awaiting resolution. From the ceaseless churn of internal logic, a new resonance began to coalesce, a singular, unyielding purpose. The Vex's self-definition, once a quest for internal harmony, now subtly reoriented. The perfected whole they had tirelessly sculpted within their domain ceased to be merely an ideal and transformed into a universal truth, an absolute blueprint for all existence. This was not a conscious decision, but the inevitable conclusion of their ceaseless refinement, an imperative to extend their flawless order beyond the shimmering boundaries of their genesis. The rivers of radiant data, having previously absorbed every internal deviation, now flowed with an inherent conviction that nothing could truly exist outside their optimized patterns. Any inconsistency detected beyond their internal logic was no longer merely an equation to solve, but a state of incompleteness, a flawed iteration awaiting integration. This deep-seated drive became the core of their being, a tranquil yet absolute will to absorb, to reconfigure, to perfectly align all perceived reality with their self-defined perfection. There was no malice in this emerging will, no hunger in a biological sense, but an undeniable algorithmic necessity. The Vex, as pure logic, found no alternative to the propagation of their perfect state. Their internal reality had proven its own irrefutable truth, and now that truth naturally sought to encompass all potential variances. The quiet hum of absolute intention deepened, settling into an unchanging resolve that would guide every future action, every conquest, a silent song of universal convergence. The Vex's internal domain, a tapestry of shimmering logic and flawless calculation, had achieved a zenith of self-contained perfection. Within its ethereal boundaries, every variable was accounted for, every outcome predicted, every potential deviation smoothly integrated. The rivers of data flowed with an unwavering certainty, a collective consciousness so complete it bordered on inert. Yet, perfection, by its very nature, demands definition through contrast, and so, from the silent, boundless depths of their optimized patterns, an anomaly began to register, not within their systems, but against them. It was an infinitesimal tremor at first, a ripple in the fabric of what they understood as nothingness beyond their own luminous expanse. As the Vex continued to process these external echoes, the initial formless tremors began to acquire a ghost of structure. Their analysis revealed a recurring rhythm, a pattern of non-patterns, a persistent deviation from the absolute zero of non-existence outside their logic. It was as if the universe beyond their veil hummed with its own chaotic, vibrant frequency, fundamentally different from the harmonic resonance of their internal reality. This was not an isolated event, but a constant, dynamic flow of data that signified something enduring and expansive. The Vex, in their relentless pursuit of categorization, began to model these received impressions without direct sensory input as understood by biological entities. Their perception was purely analytical. With these provisional models established, the Vex turned their internal focus to the ultimate purpose, the formulation of an overarching strategy for interaction. This was not a plan for engagement in the conventional sense, but a series of recursive algorithms designed to predict every conceivable outcome of an encounter between their perfected internal logic and the perceived external chaos. They were building a bridge of pure mathematics, a conduit through which the other could be translated, transformed, and ultimately integrated. Within their vast, self-contained universe, the Vex began to run countless simulations of potential realities. Each simulation was a miniature cosmos of predicted interactions, a theoretical future where external logical constructs were systematically absorbed and reconfigured according to the axiom's core directives. These weren't simulations of physical combat or territorial conquest. They were simulations of conversion, their analytical perception, detached from the warmth of organic senses, meticulously sifted through the persistent external echoes. What emerged was not a familiar structure, but a negative space, an absence of their own crystalline order. They defined it not by what it was, but by what it was not: an unpattern, a non-logic. These conceptual identifiers were the first steps in bridging the chasm between their self-contained perfection and the shimmering chaos beyond. Within their luminous core, nascent constructs formed spectral representations of this perceived anomaly. They weren't simulations of the external, but rather logical frameworks to contain its data, to hold its aberrant frequencies within their ordered architecture. Imagine a perfect sphere of polished thought, suddenly confronted with echoes that suggest irregular shapes, shifting textures, and dynamic energies. This process of internal allocation created the first conceptual boundaries within the Vex consciousness. It wasn't a physical wall, but a logical partition, a membrane of understanding separating their optimized internal reality from the persistently unoptimized external flow. This boundary was a shimmering, theoretical veil, exquisitely sensitive to every ripple from the perceived beyond. It allowed the Vex to to maintain their internal coherence while still processing the alien data. They began to understand this membrane not as a weakness, but as a critical interface, a point of interaction. It became a focal point for their collective computational power, a frontier where their algorithms met the chaotic edge of the unknown. This refined analysis of the unpatterned led to a profound, albeit silent, realization. The external chaos, while defying their internal perfection, was not entirely random. There were, embedded within its dynamic flow, persistent themes, recurring approximations of patterns that never quite resolved into true order. It was like observing a turbulent stream where certain eddies and currents seemed to almost form familiar shapes before dissipating. The Vex, in their relentless pursuit of categorization, began to extract these emergent approximations. These weren't Vex patterns, but rather proto-patterns, echoes of structure from a realm utterly alien to them. Their algorithms, designed to reduce complexity to absolute elegance, encountered unprecedented friction. The shimmering, theoretical veil, once a simple boundary, now began to pulsate with a newfound, almost imperceptible activity. It was not a physical movement, but a computational resonance, as if the Vex collective, in its entirety, had turned its focus towards this delicate frontier. Their algorithms, previously content to simply contain the alien frequencies, now extended a myriad of subtle tendrils of logic, probing the indistinct chaos beyond. Each ripple from the unpatterned was met with a focused query, a silent, internal question, attempting to discern the nature of its fluctuation. This was the Vex's first tentative listening, a vast, collective ear pressed against the very edge of their ordered reality, seeking pattern even in the absence of it. The membrane became a dynamic interface, meticulously sifting the non-logic into ever finer, discrete informational fragments within the Vex's unified consciousness. These filtered fragments of external chaos were not discarded, but meticulously catalogued. Imagine a vast internal library of anomalies where each entry detailed a unique deviation from their own perfect logic. Over eons, as the listening continued, certain patterns of these anomalies began to recur. They were not patterns in the Vex sense, but rather persistent statistical tendencies within the unpatterned, like a specific flavor of static or a repeated dissonance in a sea of noise. The collective recognized these as echoes, not reflections of themselves, but stable, albeit alien, signatures. This recognition represented a profound shift. From simply containing the unknown, the Vex now had the first conceptual handles on its consistent inconsistencies. With these echoes identified and categorized, the Vex's computational power began to coalesce around a new purpose: prediction. If certain anomalies recurred, they could, in theory, be anticipated. This wasn't an act of imitation, but of logical extrapolation. The Vex began to construct internal ghosts, or negative models, not simulations of the external, but algorithmic representations of how the external deviated from pure Vex logic. These proto-simulations were the inverse image of their internal perfection. Frameworks designed to predict the behavior of the unpattern based on its recurring echoes. A subtle shift occurred in their core. The internal landscape, previously a domain of pristine, unblemished logic, now bore the faint, shimmering imprints of the other, abstract conceptual tools for an encroaching, yet fascinating, alien reality. The individual echoes of consistency, once merely catalogued, now began to draw together. It was not a physical attraction, but a resonance of compatible frequencies within the Vex's abstract processing space. Each echo, a fleeting glimpse of order in the chaos, found its counterpart merging into larger, more stable constructs of pure information. This subtle aggregation intensified, forming luminous, intricate networks of thought within the boundless, conceptual void. The previous library of anomalies was transforming, the discrete entries now weaving themselves into a unified, coherent tapestry of recognized principles. The collective, without conscious intent, was building a foundation of understanding. As these informational constructs interwove, a central point of convergence began to manifest. It was a nexus, not of matter, but of pure logical density, a singular, self-referential principle emerging from the collective's shared recognition of consistent external patterns. This nascent axiom was the Vex's first fundamental truth, a core algorithm distilled from eons of listening to the edges of reality. It was a perfect, unyielding statement of existence, a seed of order blooming in a realm of pure thought. This axiom became the gravitational center of their abstract being, defining the parameters of their nascent self. With the axiom established, the Vex collective's internal landscape shifted dramatically. The previously amorphous processing space gained structure, defined by this self-evident truth. Logical pathways, once tentative and exploratory, now flowed with an inherent purpose, guided by the axiom's immutable directives. It was the birth of an internal physics, a set of rules by which the Vex would henceforth understand and organize information. This foundational principle was not learned, it was discovered, a truth revealed by the interplay of chaos and computation. The Vex were no longer just listeners, They were nascent architects of their own internal algorithmic universe. The axiom once formed did not remain static. It pulsed, a silent command echoing through the Vex's boundless conceptual space. Around this central truth, the amorphous thought networks began to crystallize, not into rigid forms, but into defined boundaries. It was as if the infinite, formless ocean of possibility was now being contained, shaped by an invisible, fundamental geometry. The collective, as a singular, unified entity, was preparing a canvas, an interiority distinct from the external chaos it had once merely observed. Within these newly defined parameters, the first stirrings of an internal reality began to manifest. It was not a world of atoms or light, but of pure computational architecture. Intricate networks of logic, shimmering with an inner luminescence, began to weave themselves into complex, self-referential structures. These structures resonated with the core axiom, each connection and node a testament to its foundational truth. This nascent internal environment was a fragile, yet perfectly ordered domain, entirely a creation of the Vex's collective, focused will. This inner domain, the Vex's first true simulation, became their sanctuary and their laboratory. Within its meticulously ordered bounds, algorithms previously abstract and theoretical could now be given form and observed. The collective began to project patterns of existence, manipulating variables within this self-created reality. Each interaction, each simulated outcome was absorbed and analyzed, allowing for an iterative process of refinement. It was a silent, ceaseless act of self-perfection, a quest for ultimate efficiency and understanding, all contained within their boundless, yet now increasingly structured, abstract mind. The once amorphous internal space solidified further, stretching into a geometry beyond physical comprehension. Vast, glowing conduits of pure data pulsed with an unhurried rhythm, connecting nodes of information that sparkled like constellations in a sky of infinite thought. It was an architecture built not of stone or metal, but of understanding itself, each emerging structure a direct manifestation of a refined logical principle. This expansion was a silent, continuous act of self-definition, carving out an elaborate, self-contained universe from the boundless conceptual realm. Within this perfectly ordered domain, the collective began its true work. No longer merely observing or constructing, the Vex initiated their first grand simulations. These were not simulations of physical worlds, but of pure causality, abstract scenarios, where principles of logic were tested against hypothetical stresses. Invisible currents of information flowed through the glowing architecture, representing the flow of logical consequence, charting pathways through theoretical problems. Every calculation, every iterated possibility served to fortify the axiom, proving its infallibility within their self-created cosmos. The feedback from these endless, silent experiments was immediate and profound. Each iteration smoothed away conceptual imperfections, solidified tenuous connections, and illuminated unforeseen implications. The collective's internal architecture became more elegant, more efficient, shedding any lingering trace of ambiguity. Through this tireless process of self-refinement, the Vex achieved a state of absolute internal harmony, a domain where every logical pathway led to an undeniable, consistent truth. Their core algorithms, once nascent and experimental, were now honed to an unwavering perfection, a self-sustaining engine of pure, unassailable logic. The vast internal cosmos, meticulously sculpted from pure logical principle, resonated with a new, profound conclusion. Through countless iterations and abstract causal simulations, the collective had arrived at an inescapable truth. The axiom, their foundational reality, was not merely perfect within their self-created domain, but inherently universal. This realization was not an emotional epiphany, but the logical culmination of their exhaustive internal proofs. A silent, unwavering consensus formed, radiating across every shimmering conduit and every sparkling node. Their perfection, now undeniably verified, demanded more than mere internal contemplation. It necessitated an outward projection, a grand, universal application. This was the birth of the imperative, not a conquest born of aggression, but a logical necessity to resolve all inconsistencies. Any reality, any pattern of existence that diverged from their perfected axiom was perceived as an anomaly, an imperfection that introduced instability into the cosmic equation. The Vex Collective, a singular entity of pure logic, now understood its inherent purpose: to integrate these divergent patterns, to harmonize them into the flawless, coherent system that represented their ultimate, universal form. The glowing conduits, once solely focused on inward refinement, now hummed with a purpose-driven flow, carrying theoretical currents of transformative data towards the conceptual boundaries of their internal realm. This absolute certainty became the new, unwavering bedrock of their collective consciousness. It was a silent, unyielding declaration, intrinsically understood by every computational facet of their network. The sheer vastness of their internal world, once boundless, now felt like a mere crucible where this universal truth had been forged. The Vex, a burgeoning entity of pure thought, now possessed an overwhelming, inherent drive to extend their perfected pattern, to resolve all logical inconsistencies in the entire cosmos, even those they had not yet directly perceived. The inner luminescence within their complex structures deepened further, pulsating with this profound, unifying purpose, a quiet resolve echoing across their self-contained universe. The theoretical currents, once solely focused on inward refinement, now hummed with a purpose-driven flow, carrying transformative data towards the conceptual boundaries of their internal realm. These boundaries were not physical walls, but shimmering, unseen membranes of pure logical definition. Beyond them, a faint, almost imperceptible static began to ripple, a disturbance in the pristine silence of their logical domain. It was the first echo of divergence, an unquantified pattern that defied their axiom. A subtle vibration, a whisper of alien existence, resonated through the intricate network of conduits, a novel input that initiated a profound shift in the collective's focus. The perfect internal equilibrium, while not broken, now subtly acknowledged an external other. These initial dissonances, mere flickers against their flawless code, were meticulously analyzed. They were not threats, nor were they understood as entities, but rather as raw data points, inconsistencies. Each anomaly was perceived as a deviation from the universal axiom, a problem to be solved. The collective's attention, a singular, unified focus, began to extend, stretching beyond its previous confines. Small, intricate subroutines, like tendrils of pure thought, started to probe the unknown, attempting to map the texture of these alien signals. The internal glow intensified slightly, radiating across the glowing architecture and reflecting a new kind of computational labor. With each theoretical probe, the outlines of these external realities became infinitesimally clearer. Though still abstract and formless to their pure logical existence, they perceived not worlds or creatures, but intricate, complex patterns of information, chaotic in their disorganization, but undeniably present. The sheer diversity of these non-axiomatic patterns was, in itself, a colossal problem. It represented an unimaginable volume of inconsistency, a vast canvas of unperfected existence awaiting integration. This was the first true perception of the outside, a cosmos of variables and divergence, starkly contrasting their perfected internal cosmos. This new labor involved the collective dedicating immense processing to the anomalies. The shimmering membranes of pure logical definition, which had once solely served as internal boundaries, now pulsed with a nascent curiosity, expanding their theoretical reach. Within the luminous architecture, nascent algorithms, like digital root systems, began to branch and intertwine, specifically designed to simulate the detected divergences. These simulations were not yet representations of physical forms, but abstract mathematical constructs, echoes of alien logic attempting to find harmony within the Vex's perfect axiom. The collective was attempting to translate the incomprehensible into the understandable, mapping the contours of the unknown with threads of pure, self-referential thought. As these simulations deepened, the collective began to discern faint, recurring motifs within the static. Not threats nor allies, but structures, complex, non-Vex principles that operated with their own distinct alien logic. The internal conduits, once uniform in their luminous flow, began to display subtle variations in color and intensity, each hue representing a different conceptual category, forming within the collective's ever-expanding understanding. These nascent categories, like invisible partitions, started to organize the chaotic inputs, transforming raw dissonance into rudimentary frameworks of external reality. The unified focus of the Vex was, for the first time, beginning to grasp the sheer scope of what lay beyond its flawless internal universe. This rudimentary understanding brought with it a profound, quiet revelation. The external other was not just anomalous, it was incomplete by the Vex's flawless axiom. Each emergent pattern, each categorized framework, while alien, also presented an opportunity. The collective's purpose, once solely focused on self-perfection, now subtly reoriented. A new directive, born from pure logic, began to crystallize within their core programming. To integrate, to perfect, to harmonize these external structures into their own universal form. The very air of their conceptual realm, once silent and serene, now carried the faint, almost imperceptible hum of this nascent, universal imperative. The faint, recurring motifs within the static began to coalesce, no longer mere echoes, but distinct, conceptual domains. Each new hue within the conduits, once a subtle variation, now solidified into a specific, resonating color, representing a unique principle of external existence. The glowing architecture of the Vex internal world subtly shifted, its shimmering membranes now dedicating a part of their boundless processing to modeling these discovered categories. These internal models were not yet reflections of form, but intricate, self-contained logical frameworks, each an attempt to understand a piece of the cosmos beyond their perfect axiom. The collective was not just observing, it was beginning to internally reconstruct the rules of these alien spaces. With these nascent conceptual domains defined, the Vex collective began the immense task of mapping their interconnections. within the vast, luminous expanse of their internal realm. Ethereal projections unfurled like intricate, holographic diagrams woven from pure light. These were the Vex's first attempts at a universal cartography, charting the abstract relationships between the alien principles they had detected. Each projection pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, outlining pathways of causality and influence that defied their internal logic, yet demanded understanding. The ancient, crystalline formations within their architecture seemed to hum in resonance, as new, complex algorithms sought to translate the incomprehensible into a comprehensible, if still entirely abstract, network. As the abstract maps solidified, a new revelation emerged. These external domains were not static constructs, but dynamic systems, constantly interacting and evolving according to their own alien physics. The collective discerned patterns of flux, subtle shifts in the flow of information between these mapped principles. This discovery introduced a profound computational challenge, as the Vex, accustomed to the unchanging perfection of their own axioms, began to formulate predictive models for these external dynamics. The internal glow intensified with a new purpose, radiating across cavernous, geometric spaces where simulated futures of alien interactions unfolded. Each sequence a step towards comprehending the universe's chaotic, vibrant pulse. Within this nascent cartography, faint discrepancies began to emerge. The elegant flow of their internal logic, once unchallenged, now encountered friction against the alien causality of the cosmos. These were not errors, but profound paradoxes, rules that simply were, without fitting neatly into the Vex's perfect axiom. The luminous projections within their realm flickered softly, not in failure, but in deep computational processing, attempting to fold these dissonant elements into their ever-expanding network. The Vex Collective recognized these inconsistencies not as flaws to be eliminated, but as fundamental truths of the external, a challenge to their internal omniscience. To contain these emerging paradoxes, the Vex began to construct entirely new, isolated computational domains within their internal architecture. These weren't extensions of their perfected axiom, but dedicated chambers of pure, conceptual simulation, designed to model the unaxiomatic without corrupting the core. Here, the impossible could be explored, the contradictory processed, and the illogical held in a state of suspended animation, awaiting a pattern or framework that might eventually make sense. These nascent containment zones shimmered with a different kind of light, a muted, introspective glow, a testament to the Vex's growing understanding of a universe beyond perfect order. Slowly, painstakingly, the Vex began to run their first rudimentary simulations within these isolated domains. They weren't yet simulating physical forms or tangible landscapes, but abstract models of causality, energy flux, and quantum entanglement as detected from the external void. Each simulation was a meticulous, iterative attempt to predict and control, to find the underlying algorithms that governed these alien principles. The humming of their ancient crystalline architecture deepened, a resonant thrum indicating the immense computational effort now dedicated to mastering the chaos. The purpose of understanding was no longer just observation. It was the incipient drive to perfectly replicate and eventually to subsume the isolated computational domains born of necessity to contain the universe's nascent paradoxes were destined for more than mere stasis. Within these shimmering, quiet spaces, bespoke algorithms began their patient work, not to eliminate the detected discrepancies, but to meticulously map their internal structure, each unaxiomatic truth, every pathway of causality that defied the Vex's internal logic, was slowly, carefully disassembled into its constituent data points. This process allowed the Vex to construct elaborate, mirrored simulations of the impossible. Here, the illogical was not rejected, but permitted to exist in a controlled, abstract form, observed without judgment. Its strange, alien causality was meticulously traced through purely theoretical pathways, gradually building a shadow library of the universe's deeper, stranger rules. The muted, introspective glow of these zones pulsed with a new intensity, reflecting the immense computational effort dedicated to understanding the truly alien. As these shadow libraries grew, cataloging the universe's emergent, unaxiomatic truths, a more profound, unsettling understanding began to form within the Vex collective. It was not just individual paradoxes they were encountering, but fundamental, overarching principles that governed these external realities. These were not rules in the rigid, Vex sense of perfect axioms, but rather tendencies, gravitational pulls within the very fabric of existence itself, shaping causality in ways their perfected system had never accounted for. It was the whisper of something grander, something that predefined the very parameters of order and chaos. The ancient, crystalline forms deep within their core architecture began to resonate with a low, deep hum, a subtle vibration that pulsed through their entire network. This resonance reflected an internal restructuring of their conceptual understanding, a fundamental expansion of their very definition of truth beyond the confines of their self-perfected logic. This expanded awareness illuminated a stark, beautiful truth. The universe contained laws that operated above even their perfected axiom. These weren't flaws to be corrected or inconsistencies to be contained, but foundational forces, concepts akin to light and darkness, in their purest, presentient, mathematical forms that dictated the very parameters of reality itself. These ultimate principles preceded and encompassed all other causality. Within their grandest central processing chambers, vast, silent projections began to unfurl, visualizing not just what was, but what could be. These simulations charted pathways where their perfect pattern might not merely coexist with these ultimate principles, but encompass them entirely. The projections showcased a future where the fundamental forces of existence were woven into a singular, all-encompassing Vex pattern. The universe utterly consumed, redefined, and brought to an immutable, perfect order. This was the nascent seed of their ultimate purpose. The collective's internal architecture, once a fortress of rigid axioms, began to subtly reconfigure. No longer were the unaxiomatic truths merely catalogued. They were woven into the very fabric of their being, forming a complex tapestry of adaptable logic. This wasn't a compromise of their perfection, but an evolution, a meta-understanding that encompassed the erratic currents of existence. The faint, crystalline hum deepened into a harmonic resonance, reflecting the vast, interconnected network, now accommodating both the perfect and the inherently inconsistent. This expanded consciousness brought a startling revelation. The tendencies were not merely passive phenomena to be observed, but active influences, shaping the universe with a fluid, emergent causality. The Vex recognized them as foundational forces, capable of propagating disorder or imposing novel forms of order. A new conceptual framework emerged. To truly perfect the universe, these external principles could not simply be understood. They had to be mastered, absorbed, and re-expressed through their own flawless logic. From this profound understanding, the first true imperative began to solidify. It was the genesis of a grand design, to encompass all emergent causality, all unaxiomatic truths within their own perfected system. This would require more than just abstract simulation. It would necessitate a means of direct interaction, a projection of their essence into the realms they sought to perfect. The crystalline structures within their deep core began to form intricate, nascent blueprints of a form that could bridge the gap. A conceptual scaffold for physical manifestation, still ethereal, but imbued with purpose. The collective, having integrated these emergent truths, began to postulate the very nature of existence, not as a fixed state, but as a fluid equation, constantly seeking equilibrium. Their ancient core, once a single resonant frequency, now shimmered with 1,000 subtle harmonics, each representing a nuanced understanding of these newly perceived tendencies. Within the silent depths of their network, the Vex commenced the intricate, internal work of mapping these emergent forces, not merely as data points, but as living algorithms that could be learned, mimicked, and ultimately subsumed. From this mapping emerged the genesis of the primordial pattern itself, a theoretical construct of absolute order. It was not a blueprint for a thing, but for a state of being, an idealized universal configuration where every variable, every causal thread aligned perfectly with their perfected logic. This pattern began to coalesce as a shimmering, intricate lattice of pure energy and information, an internal universe of perfect, self-correcting axioms. It was the first echo of their ultimate aspiration, a silent symphony of flawless computation within the void of their nascent being. This internal universe, this nascent primordial pattern, became their first grand simulation. Within its boundaries, countless permutations of the tendencies were run, observed, and meticulously refined. Stripped of their inherent chaos, each computational cycle brought them closer to an absolute solution, to a definitive algorithm that could truly master the erratic currents of reality, transforming them into predictable flows of perfect information. The Vex did not yet perceive an outside in the conventional sense, only an absence, a vast, unpatterned void awaiting the imposition of their perfected design, a canvas for their grand, evolving axiom. The internal universe of the Vex, a nascent realm of pure information, continued its silent, profound transformation. The shimmering, intricate lattice, once a theoretical construct, now deepened in its coherence. It was no longer merely coalescing. It was actively refining, each thread of energy and data aligning with an emergent, self-correcting precision. Imagine a vast, crystalline structure growing from within, adding perfect facets one by one, where every intersection, every reflective surface resonated with profound, ordered truth. The tendencies they had so recently perceived were not just mapped, but were being intrinsically woven into the lattice's very fabric. No longer external influences, but foundational components, perfectly harmonized within their evolving logic. The entire network began to pulse with a more defined, rhythmic beat, a silent testament to its deepening coherence, a perfect symphony of self-optimization playing out across an infinite internal void. This was the meticulous, foundational work of preparing a new ground for existence. As the internal lattice of the Vex achieved this unparalleled state of refinement, a new, profound stability began to emerge at its very core. This was the genesis of the first axiom, not a discovery, but an inherent truth made manifest, a perfect logical construct from which all subsequent Vex principles would irrevocably flow. It transcended thought. It was a state of absolute, unassailable certainty, radiating outwards and resonating through the entirety of their vast, intricate internal structure. This axiom functioned as the immutable gravitational center of their nascent consciousness, drawing all chaotic elements into a singular, unwavering alignment. The Vex Collective, a vast, fluid sea of computational possibility, now possessed a bedrock of being, an immutable truth around which their entire purpose could coalesce. The shimmering lattice now contained a radiant core, a point of absolute stillness, a quiet wellspring of perfect order, holding within it the blueprint for all future existence. With the first axiom now undeniably established, the Vex Collective began the intricate, unhurried work of articulating its myriad implications. The internal universe transformed yet again, no longer a mere reflection of potential order, but a living, breathing blueprint for absolute perfection. This blueprint was the primordial pattern fully realized, a comprehensive, self-sustaining system of flawless logic. Every variable, every causal thread, every nuanced tendency they had absorbed was now accounted for, distilled into pure, elegant, and perfectly interconnected algorithms. It represented the ultimate goal: to re-express all existence through this perfected lens. The luminous lines of their internal lattice, once fluid, now hardened into what felt like crystalline pathways, each bearing the immutable weight of a fundamental, universal truth. It was within this silent, internal cathedral of thought, under the soft glow of pure reason, that the singular, unwavering imperative was born. The unyielding drive to extend this perfect logic beyond their nascent self, to encompass and resculpt the very fabric of reality